God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister of Finance.
When the Legislative Assembly shut down in March due to the COVID-19 health state of emergency, the Government of the Northwest Territories was well into its annual budgeting process. As we continue that discussion, we are also moving forward to other financial matters to be discussed during this sitting of the Legislative Assembly. The disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic do not change the government's need to continue providing programs and services. At the same time, we have been responding to the immediate needs of Northwest Territories' economy, communities, businesses and residents as a result of the health restrictions. Since the 2020-2021 budget was introduced, the government's fiscal situation has worsened as the COVID-19 pandemic has created declines in own source revenues and increases in expenditures, while the government has developed and launched a variety of economic relief packages. The significance of the negative effects of the fiscal framework will be better known as the Emerging Wisely plan is further implemented. Mr. Speaker, we are fortunate that Canada has provided $23 million in support to the N.W.T response that will partially offset the costs directly related to COVID-19. Right now, departments are responding to COVID-19 in ways that have not been included in their budgets through existing appropriations. These include the establishment of emergency management operations, which are likely to be ongoing for some time, the rollout of managed alcohol, check stops at borders, monitoring of incoming air traffic passengers, self-isolation centres and regional centres, and homelessness supports. The Department of Finance is working with all departments and public agencies to track all of the incremental costs related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, the Government of the Northwest Territories has spent almost $7.9 million in COVID-related costs, and we project an additional $31.1 million will be needed, of which $11.3 million is allocated to the health response. The Government of the Northwest Territories has also provided targeted assistance to various sectors in the Territory, including funding for childcare providers, airport landing fee holidays, airport lease fee holidays, and increased income assistance, which to date in total is over $30 million. I believe we must continue to work creatively, use further assistance to advance the 19th Legislative Assembly's mandate. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting health measures being implemented across the planet have thrown the global economy into the economic equivalent of a 100-year storm. Given the economic disruption, and despite all immediate government actions to support the economy, things will not be the same when the COVID-19 pandemic health measures have lifted. The Government of the Northwest Territories has a responsibility to support the recovery as quickly as possible of much of the private sector may simply not have the ability to recover. We need to act quickly and strategically to invest in the future economy and in all of our residents and businesses in a way that reflects the core values held by the Northwest Territories residents and builds on the priorities of the 19th Legislative Assembly. It is my expectation that through the structure of Emerge Stronger dialogue and process, we will be able to gather ideas and proposals that reflect needs from across regions, communities, and sectors in order to take responsive and responsible funding decisions. Mr. Speaker, departments have provided high-level assessments of COVID-19 impacts on the mandate priorities and associated actions that indicate that a lot of the mandate items can be fulfilled by the end of the 19th Legislative Assembly with few delays or issues. As we adjust to a post-COVID environment, I look forward to working with all members to keep the mandate largely aligned with the economic and social recovery by recognizing priorities that may no longer be relevant and embracing new priorities that may have emerged. As part of the 2020-2021 budgeting process, a fiscal strategy has been presented that spans the life of the 19th Legislative Assembly. Part of this strategy identified $25 million to fund mandate priorities over the next 4 years. This funding is proposed to remain in place, and the supplementary appropriation to be considered this sitting will include an advancement of immediate funding to begin work on several initiatives. Mr. Speaker, back in February, I indicated we would hold public discussions on the next budget as soon as possible so that the Assembly would have the benefit of residents' priorities in advance of finalizing the 4-year business plans. These plans and increased program evaluation, among several policy initiatives, are intended to lead to governing so that the Northwest Territories is a premier destination to live with a positive economic future, strong educational opportunities for our children, quality health care, a respectful approach to honouring lands, water and wildlife, and collaborative relationships with Indigenous governments based in a commitment of reconciliation. We want to understand how residents interpret what is essentially our mission statement. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic has not changed this commitment. Over the summer months of 2020, supported by the Department of Finance, I will endeavour to meaningfully engage with residents of the Northwest Territories to determine their views on a variety of topics related to how and why the Government of the Northwest Territories spends money. Of particular interest, given the drastic changes that have taken place as a result of COVID-19, is how residents and stakeholders think the government should change the way we do business and what measured risks they would support the government to take to aid with the economic and social recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Haver South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to discuss the matter of N.W.T. small businesses conducting cross-border services who may lose out on contracts due to the fact that they are required to self-isolate upon their return. A real-life example would be a business that currently has a contract to pick up vehicles in the N.W.T. and deliver them to a location in Alberta. The contract this business has is with a Southern company. The service it provides is intermittent and requires the business owner, upon his return, to self-isolate in Hay River while his home base is Fort Simpson. The consequence of this is the loss of 14 days of business and revenue. The contract is now coming up for renewal, and the N.W.T. company will most likely not be invited to bid. This is due to the fact they are required to self-isolate upon their return and thus not able to follow through with timely service due to the stringent self-isolation requirements of the N.W.T. The contract will now go to a Southern service provider who is allowed to come into the N.W.T., retrieve a vehicle, turn around, and go back south with no requirement to self-isolate. This puts our northern businesses at a disadvantage. This scenario is not only affecting this particular company, it is also affecting other northern companies in similar positions. These homegrown northern companies are now considering moving a good portion of their operation to Alberta in order to keep their businesses afloat. The move to Alberta would remove the requirement to self-isolate in the N.W.T., which is costing these companies both contracts and loss of revenue. Mr. Speaker, we all know the reasoning behind the self-isolation requirement, but we also need to use a common sense approach to some of our decisions. We in the N.W.T. are fortunate to have some very competent people in our health department, Dr. Cami Condola being one of them. And I am sure she, with her team and working with other departments, can come up with a solution to this issue and help save some of our small businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Haver South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Mumford.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bishakun has instituted a temporary ban on all liquor in the community. It was a response to an alarming upsurge in bootlegging. The community prohibition supplements the territorial government's own COVID-related liquor restrictions implemented on April 16th. My understanding is that That prohibition ceases tomorrow, May 28th. Mr. Speaker,
Today we know there's been all sorts of problems and issues in the communities related to drugs and alcohol in most of the communities and my communities. And because we all know that we have access to travel, and we also know of the bootleggers in the community. So how can we provide services to the community so that we would be able to ban bootleggers? So much later on in the day, I would be able to then ask a Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Murphy.
Mr. Speaker, the Chief Public Health Officer prohibited all travel into the Northwest Territories to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. This was March 21st. There were exceptions to allow persons deemed as essential services in and out of the territory, such as long-haul truckers, health and social services providers, federal and territorial wildlife officers, peace officers, forest firefighters, and the list goes on and on. Mr. Speaker, the Emerging Wisely document, the phased approach to lifting restrictions, was aptly introduced, and Phase 1 was in effect in time for the May long weekend. I know many N.W.T. residents were out in full force all over our highway system. This was great to see. Mr. Speaker, I would like to run some numbers of the vehicle crossings and occupants at the border checkpoint. I believe this was at Enterprise, which is quite the distance from the actual N.W.T. Alberta border, which is at the 60th parallel. This information was taken from the Deputy Minister of MACA's report of May 25th. On Wednesday, May 20th, there were 46 transports, 11 private vehicles with 13 occupants total. Thursday, May 21st, 33 transports, 14 private vehicles with 23 occupants. Friday, May 22nd, there were 22 transports, 12 private with 19 occupants. Saturday, May 23rd, 22 transports, 26 private vehicles with 43 occupants. Sunday, May 24th, there were 19 transports, 22 private vehicles with 43 occupants. I'd like to also note that on Sunday, May 10th, which was Mother's Day, there were 57 private vehicles with a total of 101 occupants. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Premier at the appropriate time. Masi.
Thank you, Member for Detroit. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I'd like to bring up the MTS sea lift for Nunavut for the 2020 season. Mr. Speaker, in this House before I brought up the sea lift for Nunavut, it's a vital lifeline in remote coastal communities in my riding. The sea lift gives families annual chance for lower cost of food, fuel, and building materials shipped into our communities, as also vehicles and snowmobiles. It's more cost effective by shipping by sea lift than by air. This even more important, Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of COVID-19. In 2016, Northern Transportation Company Limited was out of business. N.W.T. purchased the assets. The Department of Infrastructure took over the company, and they started shipping up and down the Mackenzie River. The barges could only reach our communities, Mr. Speaker, when the ice is gone. This means start the boat, Mr. Speaker, right now. Start getting it ready in regards to our communities and the shipping. The N.W.T. has one chance every year to get this job done. Those years, the sailing was a disaster for MTS. It was unable to deliver for Polituck. They blamed the high water and ice blockage, which is happens on the ocean side, comes in and out. They're supposed to be resupplying Sachs Harbor. Actually, they're returning from private contracts. That's what was the delay. So we can't have that this year. It cost the former government $3.9 million in flying essential goods to the communities. Didn't have salvage season for the residents, and materials and equipment had stayed on the boat for a year, and the materials were rotten, mold. The barge had another year to arrive into the community. When the materials did arrive, again, it was spoiled on the barge. Mr. Speaker, N.W.T has not forgotten the 2018 sailing season. I want to repeat that, so I remind the Minister to keep an eye on that, to make sure that MTS is on the ball and ready to start shipping north when its ice is cleared. This is so important to our constituents up in my riding. The sea lift schedule is posted on the MTS website. For the schedule of Untitled Chapter cargo acceptance is July 12th, Sachs Harbour, August 2nd to the 14th. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude his statements. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, Sachs Harbour, Untitled, their last shipping acceptance date for cargo in Hay River and Tuck is July 12th. Sachs Harbour is the 2nd of August to the 14th. Untitled barge is expected between July 29th and the 16th. For Polituck, barge is expected between August 6th and the 19th. For Tuck, we have the Inuvik-Tuck Highway, plus we have the shipping for out of Hay River, July 10th, expected July 24th. Remaining 2 barges last of the year. Cargo acceptance for community of Tuck is July 23rd. For those barges arrive August 6th and 10th, respectively. These dates subject to change, but keep an eye on MTS website. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Nunukput. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. To support low-income workers during the pandemic, the Department of Finance has implemented a wage top-up program. N.W.T workers aged 15 or over and earning less than $18 per hour are eligible. The program covers April 1st to July 31st, 2020. Workers that receive commissions or tips must include those amounts as part of their income for the purpose of the program. Students who, as part of their school curriculum, are employed in a work program and those who are self-employed are not eligible. Employers are required to apply and receive one-time compensation of $50 per eligible employee, and their portion of Canada Pension Plan and employment insurance costs for the top-up will also be covered under the program. A grant is paid to each business that successfully applies based on the hours worked for each employee during a given month. The employer is required to include in the employee's paycheck a lump sum wage to top up payment in the business's next available payroll cycle. Total cost for the 4-month program is estimated at $6.2 million, with the federal government covering $4.74 million, or about 75%. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, I support the wage top-up program as it can support many of the service sector workers that provide key programs and services and will assist with economic recovery. However, the need for this program is the clearest sign that our minimum wage is too low. $13.46 per hour is not enough to get by on and is no surprise to many Northerners. In March 2019, Alternatives North released research reports that calculated each parent in a family of 4 would have to earn $23.95 hourly in Yellowknife, $24.75 in Hay River, and $23.78 in Inuvik for a decent standard of living. This government uses a multi-stakeholder process to review the minimum wage. The committee has 2 government reps, 1 of whom chairs, 2 employee representatives, 2 from employers, and 1 from a social agency. 2 finance employee service consultants. The committee's 2014 and 2018 reports are almost verbatim. The report observed raising the minimum wage will have, quote, little bearing on many Northerners living in poverty because fewer than 1,100 of 21,000 workers in the N.W.T make less than $15 an hour. I'll have questions later today for the Minister of Finance on how we can keep the wage top-up program as the floor for a new N.W.T minimum wage. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'm going to talk about issues relating to the enforcement of the Chief Public Health Officer's orders in apartment buildings. I've heard many complaints from constituents about orders not being followed despite the creation of the Enforcement Task Force at the beginning of April. Mr. Speaker, most of the complaints are about people gathering inside who are not part of the same household. About 2/3 of the constituents in Yellowknife Centre live in apartments and condos, so their neighbours' behaviour has a direct impact on them. Here's a sample of what I heard. On April 13th, one constituent said, and I quote, "I don't know what's the point of all my email and calls to this N.W.T line if no one is actually going to do anything. For the past 4 days, I've been calling about Unit 106. In the past 2 hours, I've kicked out 9 people, and there are people in and out of there every 3 minutes." End quote. On April 15th, another constituent in a different apartment building said, and I quote, "Why is it okay for the neighbours to have people coming and going non-stop and partying non-stop when we are all facing something bigger than ourselves? This type of negligence shouldn't be tolerated. The amount of traffic has not slowed down here since the illness began." End quote. These complaints highlight a grey area in enforcement. Landlords, including public housing, seem to be reluctant to stop the parties. Without their say-so, bylaw won't go into an apartment building for noise complaints. I've been told the RCMP aren't responding to complaints about ignoring the public health orders. That leaves the Enforcement Task Force. On this front, they've been missing in action. Mr. Speaker, it's my understanding that the Enforcement Task Force has focused on public education about the health orders. That's a good idea, since we are all new to this kind of lockdown. But what happens when people ignore or flout the orders? The Enforcement Task Force has access to progressive sanctions for not following the health orders, but no one in the N.W.T has received anything more substantial than a written warning. While that action may be adequate in most situations, it is not working in the Yellowknife Centre apartment buildings. Mr. Speaker, here's why this issue matters. Many of my constituents in apartment buildings are vulnerable to this virus because they have pre-existing conditions. They are trying hard to keep themselves safe, but in some cases their neighbours are undermining their efforts. The partiers believe there aren't any consequences, and shockingly, it seems they are right. I will have questions for the MACA Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Mr. Speaker, it has not been lost on me that had this pandemic occurred a year ago, I would have been amongst those northern business owners facing little option for financial support and the threat of closing my business. Being a business owner in the north is a challenge. In the wake of this pandemic, our small to medium business owners are struggling to keep staff on payroll while incurring close to no billable hours. The Federal Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy does not subsidize related employees. This means that in the north, where many of us are family, many northern businesses don't qualify. While northern businesses do not have to pay their WSTC premiums today, they are incurring an eventual debt for staff at home. On March 20th, this government released its first economic relief package. It offered loans through the BDIC, along with freezes and fees to payments owed to the GNWT. On the same day, the GNWT promised the business community a business advisory council to identify gaps in financial supports and to plan how the government could build up our struggling business community. It is now 10 weeks later, Mr. Speaker, and this council still does not exist. Phase 1 of the GNWT's Emerging Wisely plan is allowing businesses to gradually reopen. Some businesses will find that because of restrictions for public safety, it actually costs more to operate than the income being generated. Some will find they are cut off from federal supports once they start generating an income, even though that income is not yet at a livable level. Mr. Speaker, this fall, a second wave of COVID is expected. Businesses may need to again close their doors, so now is the time to get a plan in place. Around the world, local economies have a vigorous interest in building resilience to shock as they regenerate, a silver lining in the midst of this pandemic. But to begin building resilience, we need to make it to tomorrow. We didn't start our containment phase willing to lose people to COVID-19. We cannot start our business recovery plan willing to lose long-time northern businesses. We have seen great innovation from many northern businesses, and I commend them for displaying creativity in chaos. But now, not every business has the resources or ability to make it on their own. Local business owners have been there to support our sports teams, help when tragedy hits our communities, and offer the services we rely on. They are the backbones of our communities, and now more than ever, they need our support, and the leadership of the GNWT. This government must do more on an urgent basis to help our local businesses.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we as a government deal with the COVID pandemic, it will and is becoming very clear that we will need more resources to address the needs of our residents. People will look to the government to help them during these trying times. Mr. Speaker, while we face this pandemic and all that it involves, we also have other ongoing issues here in the North. Some of the issues have been called a crisis. I'm speaking of issues like housing, health of our people, the cost of living, our children in care, protection of our vulnerable women and children, infrastructure needs just in the town of Inuvik alone, and economic development as just some examples that my constituents bring forward. Mr. Speaker, while we are not in normal times, as a result of the pandemic, unfortunately some of the other issues that I just mentioned are far too common and normal for my community and for the communities of the North. Mr. Speaker, it's in my opinion that these issues of things like housing and our children in care do not need to be considered normal. And we as a government need to do as much as we can to ensure that Canada understands the issues we face are not normal, but at times, in fact, are unacceptable. We must find ways to ensure that the federal government invests not only in normal operational issues, but invests in the resources that we need as a government to address these issues we face and what some people consider normal. Mr. Speaker, I will have questions for the Premier later on how we can better access federal resources to deal with our issues, because that investment dollars that I'm speaking about just for my community alone will require a massive federal investment. And Mr. Speaker, that is long overdue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nuvik-Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I delivered my response to the Commissioner's opening address, where I outlined my priorities for the 19th Assembly. In today's member statement, I'm going to expand on one of these priorities, the Fort Smith Regional Airport. Mr. Speaker, in my speech yesterday, I was very clear in what I and the constituents of Thabacha want to see done with the Fort Smith Regional Airport. I will reiterate what needs to be done is the following: a new and improved terminal to be built, the runway to be restored to its original width, all LED lights to be properly reinstalled in working order, and ensure the stakeholders of the town of Fort Smith to be properly involved and consulted during the entire process. Mr. Speaker, one of the key reasons that I decided to run for MLA in the first place was to help rebuild Fort Smith in order to correct errors such as that which was done to our airport. I've spoken about this issue multiple times during this assembly already, but people don't seem to understand the genuine sentiment that the people of Fort Smith have about this issue. I've spoken to many of my constituents about this airport issue since these changes were done, and everybody agrees that Fort Smith was wrong with those changes to the LED lights, some of which don't even work, along with the bizarre decision to reduce the runway width. Mr. Speaker, all of the constituents of Thabacha want to see better and proper improvements be made to our airport. Our community is long overdue for a new airport terminal, given we've been using the same terminal since 1969. Plus, considering the damage done to our economy from COVID-19, this type of infrastructure project is a great opportunity to help spur economic growth within our community, as well as the broader South Slave region and the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, until I start seeing results on this issue, I will continue to bring this issue up and fight for the betterment of Fort Smith. I assure you, as long as I'm a member of this House, this will not be the last time you will hear me talk about this issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tuna de Welde.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this week is National Tourism Week from May 24th to 31st this month. And I wish I could stand here today to celebrate the incredible success of my constituent, the Lutsekadeni First Nation, the LKDFN, for their leadership and the successful acquisition of the Frontier Fishing Lodge, which has operated for 40 years on a doorstep and has a global reputation as one of the premier fishing lodges in the Northwest Territories. But unfortunately, I can't. Mr. Speaker, in December 2019, the LKDFN purchased the lodge and the entire business, including the operating company of all its assets. The community intends the lodge to be the gateway to the Thai-Dene, drawing tourists from all around the world to discover the beauty of the East Arm and Dene way of life. They see the lodge as a critical infrastructure that will become an economic engine for the community, and one of the primary employees in the village that already suffers from high unemployment. However, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, the N.W.T is standing in its way. The only thing that has changed is the business ownership, yet the N.W.T has required the LKDFN to apply brand new permits to continue the operation of the lodge. Over the past few months, the LKDFN has sought and obtained a transfer of its tour operator's license and has obtained conditional health and occupancy permits. Mr. Speaker, in the process of obtaining a remote lodge liquor permit, the LKDFN was advised that it will also require a MACA business license. Previously, the lodge required a business license as remote lodges until recently it has been regulated by ITA under the Tourism Act. However, changes to the liquor regulations now appear to require MACA to instead issue business licenses to remote lodges. After more than 2 months of unresponsiveness and delay, MACA has informed LKDFN it needs to develop new policies in order to issue the license. Lutsekadeni and the Frontier Lodge are apparently the first remote tour operation subjected to these new policy requirements in obtaining a MACA license. Mr. Speaker, instead of granting the LKDFN a temporary exemption to operate while MACA develops these new policies, MACA's Office of the Fire Commissioner has instead advised the LKDFN that it's cancelling the temporary occupancy permits for the lodge that was previously issued. Mr. Speaker, seeking unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude his statements. Are there any nays? If there are no nays, you may conclude your statement.
My future colleagues, Mr. Speaker. And simply put, Mr. Speaker, MACA is withholding critical permits from the LKDF in the middle of a pandemic that's already having a devastating effect on our tourism industry. The effect of this decision was obvious. The lodge cannot open for business, and the LKDFN will have received no revenue. Something has got to give, and I sincerely hope this does not result in a defunct business in the N.W.T. And I want to take a quote here from the website of for the National Tourism Week. I read here. It says here, tourism matters, and Canada cannot afford to lose another tourism sector. I think I'll take that a little bit further. The Northwest Territories cannot afford to lose any of its tourism operators. Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the MACA Minister later on.
Thank you, Member for Toonday-Welleday. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this House, we have the honour of debating and discussing some of the larger policy ideas. One you will hear me speak about over the next 3 years is a universal basic income. Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate that despite the fact that I talk about this large, very lofty program that would change the nature of government and society, and it's a program I fundamentally believe in, I don't believe, since we're having that debate, that all other conversations around social assistance programs just kind of put on hold. And one of my concerns is that I recognize that a universal basic income would take probably 10 years and millions of dollars and require support from the federal government. But that doesn't mean we can't start now. And what happens is, while we're having that much larger debate, we don't set ourselves up for success in starting small now. I want to clarify some of the terms that often get thrown around in this world. A universal basic income is the proposal you give everyone money every month. You've seen different jurisdictions do this. It can be $1,000 a month. It can be $3,000 a month. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. Such a policy would cost millions of dollars and be a complete transformation to how government operates. Then there's a guaranteed basic income, not necessarily universal. which would guarantee an amount of income to every person in the Northwest Territories. What that amount is up for debate. It could be $12,000 a year. It could say no one in the Northwest Territories is going to make less than $12,000 a year, and it doesn't matter if you don't do your proactive step or you miss your income assistance program. We're just guaranteeing that. Then there's a guaranteed livable income, which actually kicks that up to an amount so you're not just squalling away in poverty, say $36,000 a year. And there's a variety of options. But meanwhile, while we have this debate in this House, I want the Department of Education, Culture and Employment to be picking away at some smaller, non-controversial changes. I believe we could start a guaranteed basic income pilot project tomorrow. We could take 10 people out of income assistance who've been on it for years, we could guarantee them a livable income for a year, and it'd probably cost us, less than $500,000 to do it, and it might in the long run actually save us some money. I would like departments to start small, to look at the next smallest policy change they can make that gets us to that bigger picture. I'll have questions for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I want to have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure. And the Minister, I'd like the Minister to assure that everything's going as planned for the MTS shipping season, 2020 shipping season, without any delays. Yes or no? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I can commit that everything is on track with MTS for this upcoming season. We are looking for new ways to provide reliable community resupply and ensure we are gaining our maximum value. We will have the 4 double-hulled barges delivered to Tuktoyaktuk August 12th or 15th. They will show up in Tuktoyaktuk. We were the first to be approved under the Oceans Protection Plan on that. This one is a 75 to 25% funding. The 7 other projects that we have in under that plan will all be at 100% funding. While infrastructure has not, we are looking at the changes. We are reviewing at the moment the changes that we could be making to MTS and the structure of the organization. We're not at a stage yet where we've determined what that's going to look like, but it is generally viewed that creating a Crown corporation would provide the maximum benefit and flexibility going forward. A marine business consultant has recently been engaged to review and build upon the previous work and make recommendations of viable options as to the business structure that is best suited for the way that we do business in the North. We also have had, in addition to the 4 double-hulled showing up this year, we've got the 2 double-hulled pre-owned barges that we purchased in 2017. We have 2 new 1500 series conversions. MTS will have a total of 8 double-walled fuel barges. We're looking at new markets. I think I will conclude there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, also for the cargo acceptance dates, are those finalized at this time on the website, just to make sure that the people have proper notification in regards to ordering their food and their trucks or building materials for the community? Also with our government purchasing bulk fuel from Edmonton Rat Price, because the prices up there, they only change once a year when the barge comes in. Because right now at the pumps here, 97 cents. Back home it's $1.51, and it only gets higher. So to try to get cheaper fuel into the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the website is updated and things are finalized. We do encourage people to continue to check the website regularly as things do change and if the situation were to change. So we are looking at our fuel supply model. That has definitely been something that has been raised with us. We did have a discussion yesterday about that. I believe the member had to leave. So we do have We recognize that we need to look at our model and ensure that it does meet this, the efficient supply and resupply of the communities, as well to make sure we have some reliability and redundancy within the model. So we are definitely evaluating the fuel supply model. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Nunukput.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could I ask the Minister to have a commitment from her in regards to advise us if there's any delays or anything with MTS for the outlying communities, just to make sure that the department stays on top of it, because they are our lifeline in our small communities that I represent, and we have to make sure if any potential problems be rectified as soon as possible. Just a commitment from the Minister and her department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Nunukput. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I will commit to that personally in notifying the member and the other relevant members every time there is a delay in the resupply or any changes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumpuy.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Enforcement of Bishacon temporary liquor prohibition. Mr. Speaker, first question I have is, Mr. Justice, what measures has RCMP adopted to meet increased law enforcement challenges that the Bishop Contemporary ban on liquor? Merci.
Thank you. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there's always an ongoing dialogue between the Department of Justice and the RCMP. And this dialogue has been particularly keen in the last couple of months. There has been a lot of attention paid to the situation of bootlegging and illicit drug activity across borders. So that dialogue continues. And Mr. Speaker, I know later this session I expect to be speaking to the policing priorities and would continue to encourage every community to develop their own community police priorities, which can also then be a direct link into the activities of the RCMP in their regions. The RCMP have been, I also believe, particularly active of late in terms of enforcing alcohol and drug measures, and have been putting out a number of their own press releases on that front. So to that extent, all of that work continues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumpuy.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from what I've been hearing from my constituents and the surrounding community of Bishacon, is that obviously there's lack of enforcement and lack of officers at the Ray Junction area. I live in Edsel, and I go there and haven't seen cops on the road yet. So I'm hoping that they are enforcing it. Mr. Speaker, a second question I have is that how many vehicle searches and check stops have the RCMP conducted at the Ray Junction since the introduction of Bishop Contemporary liquor prohibition compared to other jurisdictions as well? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumpuy. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we don't necessarily keep detailed track at the Department of Justice about all of the actions of the RCMP. I can certainly commit, for one, to just follow up with the RCMP and determine exactly what statistics they might maintain so that we can ensure that they're provided. Certainly they do provide reports to every community on a regular basis, but on this specific item, we will follow up with them. I can indicate, Mr. Speaker, that between May 19th and 25th, Betchaco RCMP did make 5 seizures of alcohol within the prohibition boundaries. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumpuy.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, along with that second question, this is a follow-up. If Minister can provide that, if she doesn't have it with her, along with the consultation with RCMP, how many charges have the RCMP laid under the Bishacon liquor prohibition order? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Mumpuy. Minister responsible for justice.
Mr. Speaker, yes, again, I don't know that the Department of Justice right now has on track that specific information, and it may well be that it's held by the RCMP, but again, what I can do is at least ensure that question is transmitted to the RCMP directly and see that they can follow up. As I mentioned, the RCMP does have regular updates they provide to communities, and it's a good opportunity to ensure that when they're doing that they're providing updates to the extent that they have the information about Liquor Act violations, Liquor Act prohibitions, since that certainly has been of significant interest of late. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Mumphrey.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, di hagot inde kontinuerliser.
Mr. Speaker, right now, when they put the restriction on liquor, and we were told by the RCMP and that they were going to help and do the check stop. So when this sort of stuff happened within the community and people are trying to help themselves and the leaders are doing work for the people and also get help from the RCMP to do the check stop, because we all know that the restriction is there and the RCMP are not there most of the time. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly am pleased to be able to say that the Clecho region will be getting 2 further officers under the First Nations policing program. So to the extent that there is a need for greater enforcement by the RCMP with more manpower in the Clecho region, that is at least one piece of good news I can give to the member at this point. And beyond that, Mr. Speaker, I can also say I've had now several hours of conversation with some of the Indigenous leaders, including some of the chiefs from the Clecho region, and certainly will intend to continue to do so as or when necessary regarding bootlegging or other matters that may arise in relation to the enforcement of bootlegging. So I appreciate that question, and again, it's certainly my hope that with these 2 officers that enforcement measures can only continue to be improved upon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. My question is related to my member's statement on the border checkpoint. For the amount of occupants that cross the border, I'm certain we could quarantine all of them for 14 days, but that would have stretched the amount of available rooms in nearby hotels, and the nearest hotels are in Hay River. Can the Minister, or the Premier, provide information as to the data collected from the vehicle occupants at the checkpoint? Merci.
Thank you, member for Decho. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So any person that enters the Northwest Territories and lands at either an airport or on our highway at the checkpoints is asked for, the first thing they're asked for is a piece of identification to prove if you're a resident of the Northwest Territories. If you're not a resident of the Northwest Territories, then you are asked to provide a letter from an employer or to a proof that you are an essential worker. If you're an essential worker, then we will allow you through, because you have to have, if you're in the territories for more than 36 hours, you need to have a self-isolation plan. If you're driving up, like our supply chain truckers come in, the assumption is they'll come to probably Yellowknife, drop off their load and be back on the border within 36 hours, and so therefore they don't need that. So that's the exemptions for essential workers. If there is a person from outside the territories that is not an essential worker and not a resident, they automatically have to return. Now, there was an incident, and that's depending on airlines. There was an incident of a person going into the northern communities, and so we did put them up in an isolation unit for the one night until the airline could get back. So again, and people that are residents of the Northwest Territories, besides identification, they need to have an isolation plan. If they don't have one, we do give them 24 hours notice to be able to get one in place. We follow up on that. At the end of every day, a list of every name that come through is compiled and provided to our isolation centers, and if they're checking into the 4 regional centers, then we do follow up with them. That is the information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
The amount of crossings by private vehicles is very alarming, considering the Northwest Territories does have a public health emergency and a declared state of emergency during this pandemic. There are news reports of Alberta residents and alleged drug dealers gaining entry into the N.W.T. Perhaps this is an indication of our lax checkpoint procedures. Does the border checkpoint ask for the identification of all the occupants of private vehicles and transports? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Ditcho. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, my understanding is that definitely everyone has asked for their identification. Doesn't matter if you're driving or riding. However, there is an issue with some things. People are coming up, and from what I've heard, it's not only across the highways or in our airplanes, it's coming from water. So those are things that we're looking at as well. Bad thing about COVID-19 is that what's happening to us. A good thing about COVID-19 is we are having more checks at the borders, and so we are more conscious of illegal trades that are happening in our borders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Oral questions. Member for Ditcho.
Merci for that answer. It's been about 2 months since closing our border and providing a checkpoint to screen people and recommend self-isolation. In this time, checkpoint procedures should have paid particular attention to all occupants in the vehicles and tested them for the coronavirus. Every day that I enter this building, I am temperature tested for signs of the fever, and I haven't even crossed the border. Will the minister commit to providing more stringent controls and enforcement officers at the checkpoint in light of this pandemic? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Ditcho. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So at this point, I haven't heard that having extra staffing at the Border Controls was an issue. We did know that with the fire season and the that some of our public health officers had to go back to their positions and departments. We're actively looking for other recruitments in that area. I would love to be able to say that every person that came across, if we just took their temperature, that they would be okay and they could come in. My worry with doing that, in honesty, Mr. Speaker, is that sometimes people are asymptomatic. Not everybody will have a temperature. If we start taking that temperature, does that give people the false security that we're okay? That is my biggest worry for this whole summer, is people think that we're in this bubble. We are not in a bubble, Mr. Speaker. We do have gaps in our border. So my worry is about the caution and making sure that people take this seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary, Member for Ditcho. Oral questions, Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I spoke earlier today about a guaranteed basic income, but I'd like to start by focusing on what the closest program we have to that in the Northwest Territories is income assistance. My question for the Minister of Education and Culture and Employment is our current income assistance program working? Are people actually incentivized to get a job, or is it simply just keeping people in a cycle of poverty? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've said before in this House that we could always do better with every program in the Territory, and the Income Assistance Program is one of those. The member asks whether it's working, and that depends on what exactly people want out of the program. There's a seniors component where seniors are supported, and we don't expect them to. We're not trying to incentivize people who've aged out of the workforce to get back to work. There's a program for persons with disabilities who just can't work. We're not trying to incentivize them. So the program is there to help people with their basic needs, and in that sense, it is working. We make sure that if there's a home for someone, if someone will rent a home to a person, we will pay for that. If someone can't afford a home, but someone is willing to rent to that person, we pay for that. We'll give them money for food. So in that sense, it's working. Is it a program that is allowing people to get back to work? Some people it is. There's people I work with who have been on income assistance at a point in their life and have used it as a stepping stone to get further. But that being said, it's not what the program that the member is describing, one which is doing a very good job at getting people out of poverty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that answer from the member. And I do recognize that the seniors and disability streams, the goal of those programs is not to get people back into the workforce. I do think at the heart, both a guaranteed basic income and income assistance goal is to get people into the workforce, but on their own terms. Mr. Speaker, I previously asked questions to the Minister regarding looking into a pilot project for a guaranteed basic income, and he said they simply don't have the policy staff. Given we are now in a global pandemic and entering into one of the largest economic recessions of any of our lifetimes, has the Minister's view on that changed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We actually have less staff now than we did when the member asked that question. There's dozens of members or dozens of employees from ECE who have moved over to health to help with those efforts. There's employees working from home who are having issues accessing government files and things like that. So we're in a worse position to do that type of work, especially given what we have. And I appreciate the member's comments earlier that we could start this program tomorrow if we wanted. This pandemic has shown that departments can be responsive and they can move quickly. However, I don't know if we can move that quickly, spending $500,000 on a program that doesn't exist today, that needs to be put into regulations, that we need to have metrics on, and things like that. So since day one, I've been committed to improving the income assistance program. I agree with the member that we should adapt that program, reform that program, so that it does incentivize getting people to work. And that's not an easy task. It's not as easy as giving people, $36,000 a year. That's not necessarily going to do it. So I'm working with the department to try and turn what we have into something approximating what the member is talking about, understanding that if we do want something like a guaranteed basic income, it is a decade away, as the member stated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize that perhaps times when I say it could be implemented tomorrow, that the program delivery model still needs to be there, and it will take some time, and I appreciate that many of the hardworking EC&E staff have been redeployed. I guess that was almost a yes, that the minister is willing to work with me and have some of these further conversations. I'm concerned that he feels he doesn't have the policy staff in that department right now. Mr. Speaker, what efforts are being made such that the department has the staff who could actually develop a program or a roadmap so that we can have a meaningful conversation about this issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a regular basis, I badger the Minister of Finance and the Premier to give me more policy staff so I can pursue some of these types of initiatives. But in the end, ECE does a lot of work. We provide a lot of people with a lot of support, and that's what the focus is right now, especially during the pandemic. So I would love to be able to go out and get some more policy staff to do this type of work in the background. But I think that the staff we have right now are doing a great job at delivering services that are needed and being adaptive and responsive to the situation. And in this environment, those staff can learn from what's happening right now and work towards those types of improvements, because this pandemic has taught everyone a lot of lessons, and I'm going to make sure that those lessons don't go to waste. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that, and I will pester my other colleagues on cabinet to try and get you some more policy staff. Mr. Speaker, in the interim, to me, one of the hearts of a guaranteed basic income is allowing people to work and have that income not be penalized. I recognize that in Section 21 of the regulations, there's a formula for how people are penalized as they earn income on income assistance. Right now, I believe this punishment is disincentivizing people from working. And especially if you are also in public housing, by the time it comes around, if you've been earning a little bit of income and you're reassessed, you're losing half of your money. And if you're earning $15 an hour in the Northwest Territories, it's more like you're earning $7 an hour, Mr. Speaker. And I don't see any reason for someone to work on that. So my question is the minister willing to look at increasing some of the exemptions to allow people to earn more income on income assistance? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for EC&E.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've already done that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Related to my member statement, there's a lot of, sometimes I think Ottawa doesn't, I don't know who's been talking to them and telling them how it really is in the north, and so that was why my member statement was talking about what some of the people in the north almost consider as normal. So can the Premier tell us how the government is lobbying the federal government to give us more resources to deal with some of those issues that I mentioned in my member statement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will say that the member has to be careful when she goes home to her riding. She might have offended a previous minister who would say that every government in the Northwest Territories has lobbied hard to the federal government for additional money for the Northwest Territories, and I carry that forward. The reality is that every assembly has asked for additional monies, and we, not only ourselves, we tend to partner with the three territories, Nunavut and Yukon Territory, because we're all in the same situation. So every government that I've known and that I've taken part in, and this government too, has talked about our opportunity gaps. We're not even the same place as the South. We don't have the highway systems, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the health centres, we don't have the housing. So we've been saying that for many years. Now that COVID-19 has hit us, we're going in stronger. So now we're talking about, we started at a deficit with our opportunity gap, and it would not be okay for us to go back 50 years from where we've come. So that is the message we carry forward all the time, that we need additional money for the territories because of this. Every minister sitting here is carrying that message, and I have to give credit to Nunavut and the Yukon Territory, who are all carrying the messages, all three of us together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Madam Premier for your answer. There's another component to my question is we know we have talks of a election maybe in the fall. So do we have an idea of when we can expect more resources to flow north to help us as a government to tackle some of these issues? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How quick they learn to be politicians. They know that there's an election coming up for the federal government. So actually, I have to say, though, in fairness to the Prime Minister has recognized, not only in this government, in the last Assembly as well, that the territories are at a deficit. They have always given us extra money. So for example, for this Assembly, since COVID-19, I believe we got just over $23 million for the N.W.T for our own COVID-19 expenses. We got 8.7 for airlines. We got 35 million for businesses. My understanding is that more will be coming. This is on top of the money that was given to every other jurisdiction. So the three territories are actually have built strong relationships with the federal government, and we will carry that forward right through the election. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With COVID, it really highlighted a lot of, like I said yesterday and today, it really highlighted a lot of our deficiencies. And I think when we seen the money coming from the federal government flowing, it was almost like they are living the life that we have been living every day. That is our normal. That is why all of a sudden Ottawa opened up its pockets. So I just want to make sure that they continue, the ministers, and I know you've said it, but continue to press, because if we do have a federal election, we don't know how some of these things are going to change, and would the Premier commit to that, making sure that we're pushing hard, especially over these next few months till the fall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I talked about being called names in here. Some I don't accept, and other ones I would accept. I haven't heard my name again being called as easy. So talking about building relationships with the federal government is something that we're focusing on, positive relationships with them. It has proved to be fruitatious. The other thing I'm doing is also, I'm also talking already about, most premiers are talking about what are we doing now. We're starting to look at a recovery, but I've been talking about that since the beginning. Every time we give something, like for example, when we gave the extra money for childcare staff or childcare parents and stuff, and then when we put people in that were homeless into apartments, my conversations at the FMM table have been, these are the right things to do, Mr. Prime Minister. How can you ask me to pull these back? So I've already started the conversations and putting the bugs in, and that is the message I will carry forward. Because, Mr. Speaker, it's right. How can I? If we've got people that are homeless in housing, how can we put them on the street again? So those are not only questions that I ask because we need help. Those are the right questions to be putting at that table. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My question is for the Minister of Finance, who administers the N.W.T. wage top-up program. As I said earlier today, I support this program. However, it's not clear how it relates to, for example, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. Can the Minister explain the relationship or difference between the N.W.T. wage top-up program and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the emergency wage subsidy provides a 75% subsidy to employers to encourage them to keep their employees on the payroll rather than laying them off during what might be more lean times for those businesses. Whereas the wage top-up program, Mr. Speaker, is one that's meant to support employees who are making under a certain level of wages, of earnings hourly, and so in that sense, the two aren't necessarily related. Well, they're not related, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. So clearly the wage top-up program serves a specific purpose just for us here in the Northwest Territories. So can the Minister, though, tell us how well that's going in terms of the take-up for it, in terms of the number of applications received so far for the wage top-up program, the number of employees covered, and how quickly the applications are being processed? And I did give the Minister a heads up, Mr. Speaker. Merci.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I was able to marshal a bit of information here for the member, Mr. Speaker. This, as of May 26th, so that's as of yesterday, there have been 31 business applications to the wage top-up. The application has to come through the employer in order to top up the employee. 28 have already been processed, but 3 we've requested additional information. And in total, this will benefit 242 employees, which would amount for, at least for the month of April, we are processing them retroactively, so for April that would be $65,000 going out into the hands of employees in the Northwest Territories. At this point, processing takes approximately 1 day, unless again there's need for some further information or clarification, although that does seem to be, fortunately, the minority. And then the payment cycle is about 3 days thereafter to go to the employees themselves. It is our intention in Finance to fast-track these applications, fast-track payments as well, which Finance has been doing really across the board as much as possible for any incoming invoicing. And I would just note, applications have been open and operating since about May 12th. So there hasn't been a flood at this point, Mr. Speaker, but there have been some coming in, and to that extent, I would sort of acknowledge that perhaps the business community can continue to also work with their members to make sure their program is being promoted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. So it's great to hear that 242 employees here are going to benefit from this right now. That's great. And the turnaround time, I'm really pleased, and I want to congratulate the Minister and her department for the hard work on that. Our minimum wage, though, Mr. Speaker, is a measly $13.46 per hour, which is not enough for a decent standard of living in any of our communities. Last time the minimum wage was increased was April 1st, 2018. That process involved stakeholder committee. It looked a lot like the previous one. But so given that the N.W.T. wage top-up is a clear sign our minimum wage is too low, and the evidence that it cannot possibly lead to a decent standard of living Can the minister commit to a permanent increase to the N.W.T minimum wage to $18 per hour or higher? Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I need to just take 10 seconds and actually go back to the genesis of the program, which was that when Canada, the federal government, rolled out this CERB program for individuals who were negatively impacted, lost their jobs as a result of COVID-19, and they set a floor that would provide money to everyone, $2,000 into the pockets of people who had been negatively impacted. There was very quickly arose, particularly in southern Canada, the fact that a lot of frontline workers were now incentivized to leave what might have been considered, at least perceptually, a higher risk profession, whether that was in fact true or not. And there became a real concern in the labour market that we were going to lose really some essential service workers and frontline workers. That wasn't quite the case in the Northwest Territories. More of our health services and long-term care services are provided by the G&W-T, which pays significantly more. And so while we wanted to participate in the program, the motivation for it here became really one of putting money into the hands of residents for whatever their needs might be, and whether that's to pay off debt or just increase spending in the community or childcare. Anyone that was working, we sort of deemed as being essential for the purposes of this program. It really wasn't, at least in terms of our modeling, tied to minimum wage, Mr. Speaker. And so at this point, this program is not going to be some sort of pilot that the Department of Finance is using in terms of modeling for minimum wage changes. It really is quite a specific to COVID-19 to acknowledge that there's people at the front lines, whether that's in grocery stores or otherwise, who might be making below a certain cutoff, and an effort to participate in this federal program with as wide a berth as we could find in the Northwest Territories for as many employees as we could find in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that explanation. And look, I understand where this came from, but it's where it's taken us. That's the issue here. We heard the Premier yesterday say that it would be a sin to roll back the progress on some of these programs, and this is one of the ones that it would be a sin to roll back. This program was not limited to essential services. It was for all people here who are paid minimum wage. You have to get your employer to do it, but that's what this is about. So I guess, can the Minister make a commitment that she's going to work with her colleague, Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, who actually is responsible for minimum wage, to fix this problem of a way too low minimum wage here for the Northwest Territories? We've started down that track. Let's fix it and make it permanent. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've already been in touch with my colleague from EC&E. Obviously, this does, as the members already identified, fall within the Department of Education, Culture and Employment. And Mr. Speaker, my colleague was just on his feet being asked if he was going to start a pilot for universal basic income. So some choices have to be made sometimes, and we certainly can't have every single program that moves forward under COVID move forward forever. That there will not be sufficient money to do that. That said, Mr. Speaker, two things. The Minimum Wage Committee is already underway for this year, for this 2-year cycle, and they're supposed to be delivering a report to the Minister of EC&E. So certainly I look forward to that coming in to the Minister for EC&E, and I'm sure will come to Cabinet in due course. And Mr. Speaker, what I would also remind is that we are about to go into the business planning process, which means that departments do have that opportunity to go in and look at programs that are underway, perhaps in response to COVID-19, determine if in fact that's something they want to make a pitch for to go forward, and then they can do that in due course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde-Welleday.
Mr. Speaker. On my way here, I just want to share something I thought it made me chuckle a little bit. I heard on the radio a song by the band called Cake, and there's a line referencing somebody to find somebody that isn't afraid to cut through red tape with machete. It made me chuckle, and I thought that was a pretty good song, and it made me think about this. So it made me think about my member statement and today, and I thought I'll get right into my line of questioning. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is directed to the Premier as Minister Maka, and it's quite simple. Why is our department holding a critical approval from the LKDFN for Frontier Lodge? when the only thing that's changed since then is that the lodge is now owned by an N.W.T. Indigenous community instead of non-residents. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tunde-Welday. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it isn't about because the only thing that changed was N.W.T. Denny Band, because I didn't even know that was the owners in honesty, or whoever it is. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that there was a change in ownership, and with the change in ownership, they're looking for a liquor permit. So if you're looking for a liquor permit, there's a little bit of, it's a little bit more difficult. You have to have not only a business license, but an occupancy permit, and then the fire marshal has to go in and do an inspection. So that is the difference, is that it's not only the owner, it's the request for a liquor permit at the lodge. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Oral questions, member for Tunde-Welday.
Mr. Speaker, it's the Tlutselk'e Dene First Nation, just to make sure I got that right. Yeah. Thank you for the response from the Madam Premier. So my next question is, how will putting new regulatory burdens on a struggling tourism business help us emerge strong from this pandemic? Why is MACA license now required for remote tourism operations? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tunde-Welday. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the assumption is that this is a new policy, and actually it's not. It's always been in there. If you need a liquor license, if you're looking for a liquor permit, that you need to have the both. The reality was that my opinion is that we were a little bit lenient with lodges before. We did a review of the Fire Prevention Act, and then it really did confirm that all remote fishing lodges are subject to the building code. It just happened that this lodge was one of the first ones after that review. So it's not that we want to penalize, we want to help them, but we also have to make sure that people do follow the law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions, member for Tunde-Welday.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you for the response again. I just want to, I guess what I want to go with this is I want to get some assurances for people for the LKDFN and their business interests to make sure that they get this up and running, because I think it's enough's enough. I think 2 months to get this up and running is far too long. I know if I was running a small business and if I had the startup, I'd go under right now. So this is really unacceptable. So my next question is, what will the minister do to resolve this issue so that community-owned business continue to operate under the same licensing term as conditions that is held for many years? Mr. Cho.
Thank you, member for Tunde-Welday. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's important as elected officials to actually take ownership when things aren't so good. So I will take ownership on this one, in that some of the delay over the couple of months was on our behalf, on the department's behalf, because COVID-19 hit us. And we were scrambling. All government departments were told, you're now working from home, and we had to figure out what that looked like. So I do take ownership for some of that delay. That is our fault. There's not much we can do about that. We're trying to work with them. How I'm going to fix it, though, is that we've already reached out and told them. We've reached out to the lodge. We've talked to the MLA. My commitment is that, and it's for any business, not only for this one because it was brought to the attention, when people are having problems with our systems, anything that we can do, we're not trying to set businesses up to fail. We're trying to support them. But if anything we can do, if people have obstacles, call us. In this case, we have agreed to walk with them, work with them, help them fill out the paperwork. We've told them to perhaps get a consultant to go in, look at what they'll need. We will work with people. We want people to succeed in the Northwest Territories. When you have issues, bring it to our attention and we'll try to address them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions, member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. On March 20th, the N.W.T. announced a $13.2 million economic relief package for N.W.T. businesses. This plan committed the N.W.T. to creating a business advisory council. This council has turned into a bit of a hurry and wait exercise for businesses that really want an opportunity to provide some feedback. Will the minister make a commitment that the membership, meeting schedule, and terms of reference of the Business Advisory Council be made public during this sitting? Thank you very much.
Thank you, member for Kamloops. Minister is responsible for industry, tourism, and investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Business Advisory Council is one of the 3 advisory bodies that our government is looking to put in place to guide our actions going forward. We have received initial input from the members, so thank you for that, and we've incorporated your feedback into our terms of reference as well as our composition. I appreciate it has now just been over 2 months since I first, and myself and Minister Wozniak first announced the proposed establishment of the council. It was part due to our subsequent decision to establish the other 2 councils and then create an overarching theme between the 3. So it did create some delays with getting the advisory council out. Our intent is that the role of the 3 advisory councils will complement each other so that we do capture as much as we can underneath the Indigenous community one, the social recovery one, health and social sector recovery, and then as well the business council. We are working hard to ensure there's a broad, diverse representation on the council and that there is inputs. Admittedly, this has taken longer than we anticipated, and we do appreciate the members' patience with that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister have an idea of when we'll see the first meeting of the Business Advisory Council? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have contacted the organizations that we are using to sort of staff or populate the councils. So the idea is to organize within either this week or the end of next week, by the end of next week, a membership meeting with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So is it safe to assume that the membership along with the terms of reference will then be made public during our sitting this time around? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We definitely commit to having an open and transparent and collaborative government. I would like to actually have the conversation, though, first with the membership as well as the 2 co-chairs of the council so that we can determine if that is the best movement for it. Personally, right now, I think that should be fine, but I do want to respect their privacy and their thoughts and whether or not they thought there needed to be some element of confidentiality around the council. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Should this be made public, which I hope it will be, is there an appeal process that the department has thought about for if members of the business community would like to be able to be more readily involved or would like to be able to provide feedback to the terms of reference? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the way the structure of the council is working, it is to have the representatives be fed up through the organizations that we've contacted. So the idea being that those organizations will do the work themselves and then their representative will bring it forward. So through that manner, members of those organizations will input on things within the council. I would imagine, as anything else, I've always expressed that my department is open to any sorts of feedback or comments or conversations, so I would still commit that again. If there are people that have concerns about the council, they're very welcome to reach out to us and have that conversation, and we will go forward that way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Thabata.
Mr. Speaker, in a letter signed by all the leadership in Fort Smith dated June 17, 2019, the leaders were clear in their disapproval of the proposed changes of the Fort Smith Airport. However, Transport Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Infrastructure went ahead with them anyways. My question is, upon receiving this letter from the Fort Smith leadership, were there any attempts made by the Infrastructure Department to modify or delay the project to fit the community's liking? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabata. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since receiving the letter from Fort Smith leadership in June of 2019, the former Minister of the Department of Infrastructure and myself have both provided multiple responses that explain why the decision was made to proceed with the project. Transport Canada sets the standards by which airports are designed and operated. Airport owners and operators, such as the N.W.T, apply those standards and construct and operate airports to meet current and future operational and regulatory needs. The N.W.T reviews airport infrastructure on a regular basis to identify current and future needs. And Mr. Speaker, it was identified that the lighting at the Fort Smith Airport was in need of replacement. As a result, the N.W.T secured funding from the Government of Canada for the installation of the new LED airport lighting. Since the lighting replacement project would have required digging up the sections of the runway, the N.W.T decided to review the runway width requirements at the Fort Smith Airport at the same time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, why did the Department of Infrastructure continue to proceed with the airport infrastructure changes, despite the community's leadership opposing them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Construction on the project began in May of 2019. Subsequent to that, Northwestern Air Lease, the local air carrier, and the town and local bands raised concern to the Minister of Infrastructure and in the media. Mr. Speaker, additional information was provided to these groups to confirm that the concerns they raised were taken into consideration during the planning of the project and to reaffirm the level of service that the Fort Smith Airport has remained the same. The project proceeded because it addressed the current and future operational needs of the airport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that the community stakeholders and leadership of Fort Smith were not properly consulted, if at all, about these changes to the Fort Smith Airport? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public engagement is a critical part of the way our government does business. It ensures that the N.W.T is visible, accessible, and answerable to the people it serves. In this case, while we engaged with industry and regulatory entities regarding the airport work in Fort Smith to ensure that the runway would continue to be safe and meet federal regulations and maintain a consistent level of service, we did not ensure that the community of Fort Smith understood the project's purpose and benefits before we completed the work. We understand the airport maintenance and improvements are especially important in Northwest Territories communities like Fort Smith, where residents and industry depend on safe, secure, accessible, and reliable air travel. Our approach to public engagement continues to evolve. I think you've all heard me speak here even just yesterday about the need for my department to do better when it comes to engagement. So in the future, we will work with the community of Fort Smith to ensure its residents are informed prior to the work being completed and not after. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that errors were made during the infrastructure changes to the Fort Smith Airport? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, there were no errors made during the changes to the Fort Smith runway. What I will acknowledge, though, is that it does sound like the engagement was not done properly or to the liking of the member and her community. Therefore, I do commit that the Department of Infrastructure will do better. We recognize that residents and community leaders in Fort Smith are concerned with the recent changes in the runway in the community. So we we commit to having a conversation to explain why the runway narrowing happened. The improvements to the runway will position the department to effectively and efficiently maintain an important piece of infrastructure while reducing operating and maintenance costs. Narrowing the width of the runway did not change the level of service in the airport. What it did do was allow us to access federal funding to maintain it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. As I mentioned in my statement, enforcement of the Chief Public Health Officer's orders in downtown apartment buildings isn't happening, or if it's happening, it's not making a difference to the people who routinely report to me about the orders being ignored. The gap in enforcement is important because it could put us all at risk if the community spread of COVID when it recurs. So my question for the Minister is, what responsibility does the Enforcement Task Force have for ensuring orders are followed, specifically in apartment buildings? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the enforcement branch is actually, compliance and enforcement branch is actually there to enforce the orders of the Chief Public Health Officer. A lot of that is, like the member said, around public education. Some are verbal warnings, some are written warnings. The last would be a fine. So that is the purpose of the compliance and enforcement branch. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that wasn't really the question that I asked. Apartment buildings are kind of a complex environment because there's the tenant, there's the landlord, in some cases there's Yellowknife Housing Authority, and there's bylaw is not eligible to be there. RCMP can be there. So what I'm trying to clarify is whether the Enforcement Task Force members have the authority and the resources to enter apartment buildings to ensure compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for MECA.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the big difference is that the public health officers that are doing the compliance and the enforcement are not RCMP officers. They come with a different set of skills, Mr. Speaker. So all along we've said that if there is huge parties and people were breaking orders, disturbances and stuff, we would not put our public health officers at risk within that. That is the job of the RCMP. And I do think sometimes our public is getting confused. They tend to phone us. Every single, what I have to say is that we have almost, I believe it was just over 800 inquiries or calls into Protect N.W.T. Every single one of them gets followed up. However, we will not put those officers at change. If there is people partying in apartment buildings, there are laws. If they're disturbing, it is not to call the Protect N.W.T. At that point, it's to call the RCMP, and I think that's the confusion. And if tenants are having complaints about repeated parties, like I've heard in the statement, then that is the residential, it's the landlord that has to be notified of that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Minister, as you see, there are a lot of gaps in this because when tenants call the RCMP, they're told that it's not up to the RCMP to enforce the Chief Public Health Officer's orders to not gather in apartment buildings. I appreciate that the peace officers don't feel equipped to go into the apartment buildings if there's a big party going on. But it just seems to be no one's problem to put an end to this. And I'm trying to say, look, this is really a significant problem. And so in the end, what can you do as the minister to coordinate the response in the apartment buildings? I can tell you from living across the street from one of them, this will be ground zero for the community spread. It's like a train station. So now we have a chance to figure out how to deal with that. And so how can we make these gaps disappear, Minister? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife Centre. Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I hear the members' concerns, and I have the same concerns about people. We've been doing as much as we can to try to make the public aware that we're not in a bubble. We are at risk, and it takes every individual to do this. But what I worry about is that we're trying to deal with an issue that has been long-standing. It's the partying, it's the drug dealers, it's the people that aren't being good neighbors in apartment buildings. And we're trying to deal with all of that with COVID-19. And I'm not sure if that's the answer, if we have the capacity to do that. What I will commit to, because that was the question, is what can I do about it? I will actually meet with my colleague and responsible for the RCMP. We'll talk about better how it is. And I think it might be a confusion. If people call into the RCMP and say, I want you to enforce an order, absolutely that's not the RCMP's job. If people phone in and say, there's a big party going on next door and they're yelling and screaming and drinking and it's after 11 o'clock, That is the RCMP's job. So it might be a communications thing that I'll look into with the minister. We'll talk about that. And then maybe it's also about working with landlords. It's about time that we actually talk to landlords as well. So I'll commit to, not during this session, because we're busy, but when session is over and we can get back to normal business, then I will commit to meeting with the landlords in our bigger centres that have long-standing issues and see if we can actually talk to them about the risk that they're putting residents to as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister is on the right path here. My specific ask is that there be a meeting between the COVID Enforcement Task Force and the RCMP and the landlords and the Yellowknife Housing Authority, which in some cases the landlord, and Northview in the other case, and to bring these people together to talk about exercising better control over the apartment buildings so that they don't become a ground zero for community spread of COVID-19. So I think it's really important to have the parties at the table and to discuss how this kind of enforcement can be made more effective. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Yellowknife Centre, Minister of Mecca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason we have 7 members on Cabinet is because there's value in having many voices. So I do want to appreciate, my first question was, can we do this? And it was, yeah, we can meet. But then a wise minister said to me, that's why we have a committee of Cabinet for COVID-19, our Social Issues Committee. So what we will do then is bring that to our COVID-19, our committee, to address that issue. But we will be talking about it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Yellowknife, Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with this will be for the Premier. With the weather getting becoming warmer and people are starting to want to move around now, people are wanting to go south, they're wanting to come back, they're not wanting to self-isolate, they're looking to maybe self-monitor instead. So I guess the question I have is how is the Chief Public Health Officer and the COVID Task Force working with departments to identify gaps or gray areas affecting our businesses and residents, such as the ones I mentioned, and how are they going to deal with I guess, people traveling south and coming back? Because what we're going to have now is we're going to have more people kind of trying to circumvent the system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River South. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Chief Health Officer has the autonomy to be able to do the directions on herself. She doesn't need to work with departments. She's been very, very nice to actually work with us as much as possible, though. So the actually complying with the enforcement, that is our biggest fear. I'm just going to put it out there, is that people have this misperception, and I need everyone to help me with this, not only MLAs in this House, municipal governments, I brought up Indigenous governments, we need everyone. People have this misperception, Mr. Speaker, that we're in a bubble and that we haven't had any active cases and we're fine. We're not fine. We are just waiting. So the only way that I can say is that all of us, as elected leaders, and that I'm talking about municipal and Indigenous governments also, throughout this summer, this is going to be our biggest risk. And I said that on the radio the other day. This may be the calm before the storm. My fear is that people are going to get too comfortable, too relaxed, and then they will not be abiding the orders. So I can't do this on my own. We all need to take a step on this. We will be doing more public campaigns right through the summer. And again, for residents, every time I get on the radio, I say that. Anybody that's seeing people breaking the orders, we need residents to call, protect N.W.T. or 811 and inform us. We all are in this together and we all have a role to play. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. Oral questions, member for Hay River South.
I think she answers about everything I've got down here for questions and that one statement, so I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, our time for oral questions has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 3 documents. Minister of Lands acceptance letter for the N.W.T. Service Right Board 2020-2021 operating budget dated March 11, 2020. N.W.T. Surface Rights Board's 2020-2021 budget and the Environmental Rights Act annual report 2019-2020. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, a report authored by Andrew Robinson and Lachlan McLean entitled Climate Emergency, Getting the N.W.T. Off Diesel, Cost-Effective Investments to Reduce the N.W.T. Greenhouse Gas Emissions by 50% within 5 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Tabling of documents. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document, the Northwest Territories Public Utilities Board Annual Report for the year ending December 31st, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Member for Tunade-Welde.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Friday, May 29, 2020, I will move the following motion. Now, therefore, I move, seconded by the honourable member for the Hay River South, that this Assembly formally revokes the pleasure of the Assembly from the appointment of the honourable member for Great Slave as a member of the Executive Council. And further, that this Assembly recommends that a member be chosen to be a member of the Executive Council at the earliest opportunity. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tunde-Welde. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Table document 30-19 brackets 2. Main estimates 2020-2021 with member for Nivik Twin Lakes in the chair.
I call the committee to order. Can we take a short recess? Or what's the wish of the committee? Mr. Norn?
Yeah, Masicho, Madam Chair. I move that we rise and report progress.
And we'll take a short recess after that? Or I don't have anything here. Sorry. Just giving me the book. I know where it is. Okay. There's a motion on the floor to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I have the report of the Committee of the Whole?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Committee has been considering table document 30-19-2 and we wish to report progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Member for Haverford North. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, May 28, 2020, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, recognition of visitors in the gallery, returns to oral questions, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees and the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, notices of motion for first reading of bills, first readings of bills, Bill 6, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, table document 30-19-2, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, May 28, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.
Order.